Welcome to a series of podcasts
created by the Experimental Film and Media Arts class at Universität der Künste in Berlin.
Of Professor Nina Fischer in collaboration with curator Vanina Saracino and artist Lily Kuschel.
The program brings together artists, scientists, curators and experts from other fields
who inspired us to observe and reflect upon our surroundings in a critical way. We inquire into new forms of research and artistic strategies.
And we are interested in a conscious shift of perspective.
Perspectives that take a distance from anthropocentric worldviewings
and binary thinking in a favor of a tentacular one.
We share images, sounds, experiments, moments, anecdotes and videos, and thoughts that enable us to expand our sensing and understanding of a world within a more than human dimension.
And as you know, we have today a very special guest, Oliver Ressel. We're both in Vienna, so for a moment we have thought, let's have the presentation, both of us in front of the same computer. But why? We are doing this in the most contemporary way. So Oliver is in Vienna at probably 10 kilometers from here or so, and I'm at another studio. And Oliver, as I mentioned with you, we have watched within the class the two works of yours, Code Road and Zad. Not entirely, but we have seen several excerpts of them and discussed them with the students. So we're very happy to have you with us, and thank you very much for accepting this invitation and coming to share your work with our class.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation. Yeah, I started a couple of years ago to focus on the climate crisis, and the first project I worked on, and it was also one of the first institutional exhibitions I had, was 100 Jahre Treibhauseffekt, 100 years of greenhouse effect. And this is a project I carried out in 1996, and it referred to a text the Swedish scientist Svante Arrhenius published 100 years before in 1896, and this text is considered to be the first paper published in a scientific magazine that is about the relationships between the burning of fossil fuels, coal at that time in the context of Sweden, and the increase of the global temperature. This text was quite contested, but it starts a beginning of a controversy about the Anthropocenic global warming. So several years later, my work on the climate crisis changed quite a bit with the emergence of the climate justice movement. So the free channel slide installation you can see here as an image I carried out in 2008. The material was recorded in the framework of a climate camp at Kingsnorth in the UK. That was more or less the first time I worked in relation to climate crisis with the climate justice movement. It's also the first time I carried out a slide installation. The main reason was that it was not possible, it was not permitted within the framework of this camp to film, and therefore I decided to to produce photos and to make audio recordings, and I combined them and I created something like a filmic structure. But it's also an example that sometimes certain situations, certain contexts enforce a specific format. I would not have chosen otherwise as an artist, but this of course happens quite frequently. So this free channel slide installation I carried out in 2008. You can see the entire piece on my webpage, Ressler.at, where this is in a documentation there in the entire length of something like 16 minutes. A few years later on, I started with a project, Everything's Coming Together While Everything's Falling Apart. I think in the course of this seminar, Vanina showed already excerpts of two of the films that I carried out in the framework of this project. The entire cycle is on forms of mass civil disobedience. The pieces, they focus on specific events. So the first film I carried out on the COP21 that took place in December 2015 in Paris. So exactly 6 years from now, as we are still in the state of having this COP26 in Glasgow. And yeah, there was already quite a bit of protest at that time. It was also a very specific situation because this meeting took place just a few weeks after this terror attack in this nightclub in Paris. So there was a state of exception, and certain possibilities to meet in public space were planned. It's of course also a political decision which places and which forms of activities to ban and which to allow. While shopping malls and Christmas markets were open, it was not permitted to have a demonstration, for example. As Macron wanted to present also himself as the person who is able to solve this climate crisis, and he did not want to have a resistance against his technocratic approach and the technocratic approach of the entire COP procedure, to have lots of demonstrations against this approach, so visible for an international public. So there's also one film on Ende Gelände. Ende Gelände is a group in Germany that does these actions of mass civil disobedience. I'm sure several of you know it. There's also a film about that. You can find it on my webpage or on my YouTube channel. It was also carried out in 2016. So this entire project started like a 2-channel video installation, and then like every year I managed to add one more film to this cycle. So at the time when it was a 3-channel video installation, it was presented in 2017 in Berlin at the Berliner Herbstsalon. Maybe some of you have seen it in that context. I think Nina also participated in that exhibition, and we also met on that occasion. It became a 4-channel video installation. This is an installation shot of an exhibition at the Kunsthaus in Vienna here. In 2020, it became, at the beginning of 2020, a 5-channel video installation. This is here a solo exhibition at the Center of Contemporary Art in Belgrade, where 5 of the films were presented, and in the meantime it's a 6-channel video installation. And yeah, so I thought that I would want to show the short excerpt of the most recent of these films. It's just a 4-minute long excerpt, which I carried out in the framework of the first climate camp that took place in Venice, and the first climate camp that took place in Italy, that took place in Venice in 2019 in September, at the same time when there was also the Venice Film Festival. And one of the activities there was actually a blockade of the Venice Film Festival. It was not directly targeting the Venice Film Festival, but used the and a great number of TV stations and journalists being there for the film festival in order to bring the content of the climate emergency towards media attention. And it was a very effective act of civil disobedience. So very early in the morning, like 4 a.m. or 5 p.m., a few hundred people were running through the security lines, and yeah, there were not so many securities and police forces there, so it was not very difficult to reach this red carpet, and it was occupied for 9 or 10 hours. And there were certain talks and speeches there, and one of these talks was by the Italian activist, curator, theorist, writer Marco Paravalle, which was also interesting because it made this direct reference to the arts, and especially to the film festival, and about the necessity of the arts and the social movement to engage with each other. And so I included that in the film, and I would like to show this excerpt to you. I hope it's running.
Maybe not many of you know that these windows here are the windows where the offices of the board of the Biennale is. And the guys that watched us today for the whole duration of the demonstration are part of the board of the Biennale. So these guys, now are police. But the point is that the Biennale lost a great, important and fundamental occasion. Lost the occasion to stand firmly for climate justice today. And this reminds us how necessary we are as climate justice movements, as social movements. You know, the Biennale is full, all these cultural institutions are full of films or works of art which are radical, which are beautiful, but then this is cultural institution of capitalism. They show radical art, but when is the time to clearly stand up when they face something that is not a product, even a cultural product, they are silent in a very shameful way. So that's why, especially with climate justice, you cannot be happy with the fact that media are talking about it, with the fact that the climate crisis is represented, but we need a radical action like the one exactly that we did today. So I would say shame on you to the Biennale. Biennale totally dedicated to democracy and to the coup d'etat in Chile when Pinochet raised to power. But nowadays, it's much easier to treat these issues such justice, democracy, climate justice as products that can be represented on the market. We're not happy with it. We have to unmask all this operation, and we have to tell them that we're not believing their lies, and that they lost the location today. But this is not a farewell, so see you later, Vietnam.
So with this film, I more or less concluded the cycle. Everything's coming together, while everything's falling apart. A cycle on different forms and events of mass civil disobedience in the context of the climate crisis. And already while I was completing this film, I started to work on a new cycle of works, a new body of works, in the framework of the project Barricading the Ice Sheets, which is a research project that deals with the climate crisis, again with the climate justice movement, but also to some extent has the focus on how this relates to the art and how cultural producers relate to the climate justice movement. So it's a project in the framework of which books are being presented, conferences are being carried out, exhibitions are being carried out, films are being produced, photographic works like this, for example, here in the background, a work that inscribes text on a landscape, permafrost landscapes, and refers to the fact that the permafrost is probably not so permanent than its name implies. A piece that is being presented within exhibitions, but can also be presented in public space. This was even a billboard in Berlin in the framework of a project of an exhibition curated by Reimer Stange. That's another piece, an oil spill. We are all learning about nature's circulatory systems by poisoning them, an oil spill in which also text is being embedded. And these works, among several others, are part of the first solo exhibition I have currently in Graz, in the Camera Austria. It's a cycle of 5 solo exhibitions under the framework of Barricading the Ice Sheets. You can also see here a tripod, a very special tripod. You know, tripods are usually being used in forms of civil disobedience, in blockades, to block, for example, the entrance of an important infrastructure so that no one can leave or enter anymore. Or it can also be in order to hinder the destruction of, for example, a forest that is meant to be destroyed. And here, this is a very specific tripod. When you look carefully, you can see that the wooden logs end in drill bits, and these are actually drill bits from the petroleum industry. And the idea of it is to use certain things that should not be used anymore. I think there's really a necessity to leave the petroleum in the ground and not to continue extracting and continue with the destruction of our climate. and therefore also these drill bits could maybe be reused, and here they are just being reused for this iconic tool of civil disobedience. And yeah, here you can also see a photographic work here on the right-hand side of the image, showing a local site of struggle. So this is the Lobau in Vienna, this forest you can see, and it's a national park as part of the outskirts of Vienna, and there's a current plan to build a highway underneath this national park, and so it would imply an 8-kilometer long tunnel, and there is already a blockade of several of the construction sites of the streets leading to this planned tunnel. So we have 3 blockades right now at the moment, and most of them already continue for more than 2 months. So I tried to create an image that shows, for example, possible usage of this tripod. And in the framework of the exhibition, also different new films were produced, one of them focusing on the role of artists and cultural producers in the climate justice movement, that consists of 5 protagonists of the movement that talk about their own personal involvement in the movement, and about how they think the movement could be increased, and how the actions of the movement could really lead towards climate justice and decarbonization. And so one of the new films I carried out in the framework of the project is also connected with an act of civil disobedience, but it's very different to the films Everything's Coming Together While Everything's Falling Apart, in that aspect that it does not focus so much on the actual act of civil disobedience, but it focuses on the necessary discussions that take place in the background in order to make these acts of civil disobedience possible. And from all the films I carried out on civil disobedience, this was by far the most complicated to carry out because it documents one of the assemblies. And as you can imagine, to document an assembly involves a certain risk of all the participants of the assembly, because they might be considered the conveners of that act of civil disobedience. And this assembly I document here took place in Spain, in Madrid, and there are quite strict, there's a quite strict law, and each of these people who participate in this assembly might face quite high penalties that go into the 10,000s of euros. So I decided for a certain level of anonymization of all the participants. So there are 2 forms of how to create a level of anonymization. One is this pixelation, which is a quite common thing, but I decided not only to pixelize the faces, which very often is being regarded by people then as that these are criminals, with what I wanted to avoid, but I created an overall image of pixelization, which finally looks quite artistic. even though this was maybe not the intention from the very beginning on, but finally I decided for something that can be regarded by an audience as something very artistic. And the second one is a bit more complex, and I will just show an excerpt of this 30-minute long film to give you an idea of how it's looking like.
Algunas demandas. O sea, que podemos decir aquí los 4 puntos que tomo, pero sobre todo, ¿cómo queréis valorarlo para tener las demandas para mañana? Porque todavía estaría bien el propio domingo tener copias también de las demandas para la gente. Las demandas son que la declaración de emergencia sea efectiva, se traduzca en poner el máximo de recursos del gobierno dando prioridad a la emergencia climática y ecológica, que se diga la verdad de la situación, de la crítica situación en la que estamos. El tema de la acción, que siempre está el punto de las fechas de los dos, la manera de resolver eso es que acción política decidida, o sea, hace falta políticas decididas con al menos un 10% de reducciones de emisiones anual para llegar a 0 emisiones netas antes del 2030. Si tenéis algún conflicto con eso, es el momento como de decirlo. Y la tercera es la democracia real, que se traduzca en mecanismos participativos eficaces de supervisión y control de las políticas. Ejemplo de asamblea ciudadana, que no entramos en poner nada de sorteo ni nada por el estilo. Y la última, justicia climática, con un eje... Sí, o sea, son el 0 que es como 0 de declaración de menos 0, las 3 tradicionales y la de justicia climática del final. Y con un párrafo inicial de por qué recurrimos a la desobediencia civil ante la situación en la que estamos. Y el punto más delicado, o sea, que hemos sacado pues, cosas que sabíamos que difícil que no iban a entrar, ¿cómo formulamos el tema de vuestra fecha? ¿Cuál es?
Emisiones netas en 2040. Que no es, ojo, que no es nuestra fecha, que es la que dice la gente que se puede alcanzar. Todo lo que sea por debajo de 2040 no hay aval científico que nos gustaría, pero nos gustaría que fuese mañana.
Bueno, lo que se puede no se puede, hay sociedades viviendo con 0 de emisiones y menos. O sea,
claro, hay sociedades, pero estamos hablando de que el planeta cambie su modelo.
Claro. Ahí está la verdad.
Bueno, es que también hablamos de un consenso entre una coalición amplia de colectivos ecologistas en la Unión Europea.
Ya, pero que sepamos que sí que hay sociedades viviendo con 0 neto, pues son, o sea, que da igual, que no podemos entrar a discutir que si no es vale, entonces la fecha de referencia final.
Quitamos porque para el XR no es asumible también un poco ponerlo.
La quitamos y ya está.
Podemos poner como pasó en la manifestación en el menor tiempo posible.
Reducciones drásticas en el menor tiempo posible. Creo que el proceso que podemos llevar, chicos, no vamos a irnos más porque no me gusta, pero yo creo que lo que necesitamos.
Antes hemos preguntado quiénes no querían salir en la grabación y se han levantado unas manos por aquí, pero luego han preguntado si queréis que se pixele. Lo digo también porque una asamblea con caras tapadas también insinúa el carácter delictivo de una historia, entonces es como un poco extraño, entonces como que no sé muy bien si queréis realmente que todas las caras salgan pixeladas o queréis que ciertas personas...
Sí, porque esto va a salir publicado dentro de a lo mejor un año en Austria, Inglaterra, y cuando esa taquillero en los cines ideales.
Yo creo que esto va a crecer mucho, no lo sé.
Que levante la mano quien específicamente quiera que se lo pixelemos. They want to be pixelated. Means the one that wants to be pixelated. Sí. Me parece hacer una formación sobre cambio climático que no haya 10-15 minutos para hablar de la base de la campaña, me parece fatal. Al final no solo hablar de lo que vamos a hacer, sino lo importante que es porque lo vamos a hacer. Igual que este manifiesto, creo que delante de las 800 personas debería de leerse, debería de haber una explicación sobre el cambio climático que queremos conseguir.
Nosotros tenemos la nuestra, quiero decir que ahí no vamos a llegar a ningún punto, los puntos.
El tiempo de la formación de que era ya muy justo y además de que la gente sabe porque se expone a la resiliencia civil. Creo que esta formación sobre el cambio climático, además una charla de 15 minutos para 500 personas, me parece una forma de educación que también además es muy autoritaria, que no es una forma mía, ¿no? Entonces, tenemos lo adecuado para esto. Que sí tenemos que explicar bien qué es una alianza, qué son los movimientos, para que este sí es importante, pero creo que este no es el lugar, la formación del domingo, una mini charla de cambio climático.
No, y incorporando un poco lo de antes, creo que sí que, bueno, la sensación que me da es que resulta que...
Continue, bitte.
550 para los codos.
So you can see that in the second part, I used the outlines of the members of the assembly as the form in whose shape then the material of the training and later of the act of the civil disobedience are embedded. So the main action was the blockade of a central bridge in the city, an inner city highway that is close to the Ministry of Environmental Affairs, and that was blocked for several hours and caused for sure a huge traffic jam. So there was also a boat used, you can see here, that was used to block the street. So I think as far as I see, we are a bit short of time. I was actually planning to present another film I produced in Norway on CCS, carbon capture and storage. In Norway, there's the largest research facility for carbon capture and storage, which is a technique where in the refinery process, in the process of producing petroleum, the carbon emissions are being absorbed, and the plan is to put them somewhere underneath in old storage facilities of petroleum production. But this is more or less how the industry wants to continue extracting oil. So it's a kind of a greenwashing strategy. And I did a film on that, but I think there's no time to talk about this film. So therefore, I think I will end the presentation here, and we should have a few questions.
Oliver, thank you so much for your presentation, and also for allowing some time for the discussion.
Yeah, thank you very much, Oliver.
Thank you.
I like the presentation very much. And I would also have a few questions, but maybe we can also first open the ground for the students. And then later on, I will also ask you something. Maybe meanwhile, I'll ask something that I already had in mind. Oliver, I always wanted to ask you. I really like your practice, and also that you're already working on the subject since so many years, and documenting, but not only documenting, also creating these films and artworks about all the different activities of activism and collective action. And I was wondering if you, or I think so, that you probably also know the Ogawa productions from Japan. And for those who don't know Ogawa Productions, it was a filmmaker or a whole team who documented the building of Narita Airport near Tokyo, and beginning from the 60s when the first mobile cameras appeared, and in the beginning even without a synchronized sound, and later of course with synchronized sound from the 60s and 70s. And they really lived on this airport and documented all the protests, which also take place parallel to the times of the airport protests in Frankfurt. And already in that time, the different activist groups were also in contact with each other and learned from each other, even though the practice also from the police or the reaction of the civilization or of the society was completely different. And I think the work of Oliver is very much in this tradition also to keep documenting and stay very close also to collective action. Yeah, thanks for presenting your work.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a history of different artistic practices on which this practice I developed over the past few years is based on, right? And several of these practices are pretty close, I think, to activism, and others are at least have a very political approach. And I think it's also quite visible that my work can have a huge variety of different approaches. So it's not, some of the works might be quite close to a more documentary approach, like the film on the Zart you saw, or maybe the film where I showed the short excerpt on the Venice Climate Camp. And others appear to be more experimental, like the one on this Madrid assembly. Whereas I have to say that from the beginning, when I start to work on projects, it's never so clear in which direction these projects will develop, because they develop usually in a specific direction through a dialogue with people and through producing work in specific contexts. So I did, for example, an entire cycle of films on worker-controlled factories, so factories where the workers manage to kick out the bosses and run the production on their own. I documented primarily the assemblies as the main source of, or the main tool of decision-making processes, which I find super interesting. So on a practical level, this was very similar, something very similar I recorded in Madrid. But if you look at the final results, they are looking very different from each other, because these workers are visible with their faces, and you see these people interacting with each other, sometimes struggling or disputing, and sometimes agreeing on it and trying to come up to their democratic decisions. In Madrid, in this assembly, we experienced something very similar, and this format really emerges due to the situation that there's this need for legal reasons to make these people invisible in order not to endanger them. And that led towards the format, which I think became also clear through the presentation.
Yes, yeah, that was also another question. Thanks. I really like the way you treated finally this subject of censorship or self-censorship, or also the attention not to show these activists. And I also already came across such a situation in one of our works in Japan. We filmed fugitives from after Fukushima and had a whole setup with a workshop, and we're working with these people. And then after the production, after the filming, some of them said, it's okay if you use our voices, but we don't want to be showed. And so we had to find an idea how to cover their faces. And I wanted to ask you, because I think you also might have come across such situations. So if you already produced something and it's already decided it will be shown in an exhibition for a long time, but then suddenly during post-production, people come up and say, I don't know, maybe I don't want to be in this video. So how do you deal with this situation? And how do you explain your practice?
Yeah, I mean, one thing is that at the beginning, before I start to film, I really try to find an agreement with everyone who participates. And and this already usually changes the idea I might have had from the beginning, just because I see certain things are not possible to do, but maybe others I did not think about might become possible, because there seems to be an agreement. This film on the CAAC I did, the landscapes seem to be the entire area seems to be quite empty, right? You only see very few people being there, which is not how the CAAC looks if you just go there and walk there. It's only how it appears in my film, just because the huge majority of the people does not want to be on camera for good reasons. So I completely understand, right? But what you see in the film is not the reality you get if you just walk there without obviously filming. But I think that's okay. I mean, yes, we are used to the idea that it's only a very specific other form of reality we create through filming, and it's not necessarily the same level of reality you might experience in a different situation.
Also gives the chance, of course, to think about different ways and create the works around it, because we have to deal with it and also to find a visual solution.
Yeah. Also, for example, I had one case, it's the CAAC film again, where from the beginning of the filming it was clear that they would only participate in this production process if the entire work is being put under a Creative Commons license, and if it's made available for free online from the beginning, which is, you can find numerous of my films online on Vimeo, on my webpage, on my YouTube channel, or on different other platforms. But usually I wait like 2 years, 2.5 years, till I make the works online, just because I also submit them to film festivals, and it's usually not possible to show the work in film festivals when they are also available online. So therefore, it's kind of a compromise I'm not super happy with, but it's kind of, you have to deal with existing situations. In this case, yeah, I saw it's the only possibility to do this film. It was more important for me than to have this possibility of an additional audience through film festivals, and I agreed. So this film is Creative Commons.
Oliver, I also wanted to ask you if you can speak a bit about the importance, or your opinion rather, regarding the importance of the use of public space when we exhibit such practices. Whether you think that this somehow may support the civil disobedience that you're thematizing in your works, and how. Because we have seen different examples of your exhibitions, some of them in the White Cube, some of them in public, or at least one example in public space. I know you work as well with public space. I know that the exhibition that you have now in a sort of White Cube situation at Q21 in Vienna is actually very well present. I like very much the fact that the doors are always open, and it functions urbanly as a walk-through. Somehow you can walk through, and the access is free. You don't have to pay. So this already is a way of acting on a White Cube space in a very inclusive way. Maybe you can tell us something more about this.
Yeah, I mean, I started to work as an artist in public space. So this is actually where I come from. I started with poster campaigns and things like that. I really still like to work in public space, but I also see certain limitations, right? So that it's super complicated to expand something in public space that is comparable to the kind of content you can include in a 30-minute long film, for example. So therefore, I decided to do both of these things at the same time. And yeah, you mentioned this exhibition in Vienna, and the exhibition in Graz is also similar in that sense, that even though both of these exhibitions take place in art institutions in White Cubes, they actually deal with the public space. These are exhibitions that that discuss about possibilities of taking actions in public space in order to change the politics and the political sphere. So I don't see this distinction not that much anymore as I maybe saw it 25 years ago. I think we can use exhibition spaces to address political issues, and I think these are super important spaces we should really never give up. These are spaces where you can present and talk, usually without that much censorship, even though these cases exist, and I also experienced them, but in generally compared to other spaces, they are really, it's really possible to address topics from marginalized viewpoints or standpoints, and therefore I really like to present it. There was a nice article because the exhibition at the Camera Austria in Graz is being presented at the same time while the largest Austrian festival is being presented, the Steirischer Herbst, and the exhibition at the Camera Austria is not part of the Steirischer Herbst, so it's just taking place at the same time. And the Steirischer Herbst, all the productions, they take place in public space. So you see then the installation by, I don't know, Thomas Hirschhorn, and he's presenting it just in a small corner in a square. And then you have a concert, and this is more like a one-day event, and all different kinds of events. And this article was referring to the differences between doing projects in the public that are political, in a sense that they deal with political issues, but maybe are not political in the sense that they are intended to overthrow the existing political system in a clear manner, while in distinction to my work, which takes place in an art institutional space as an exhibition, but clearly has the intention, and this is clear from all works being presented there, to overcome with a capitalist system and the domination of rule and representative democracy, to establish a new way of how to work and live together, and everything framed through this context of climate justice and the possibility of complete extinction due to the increased warming on our planet.
Oliver, is the article online? Do you think you could send us the link later on so that we can maybe also read it? Sounds
yeah,
really
I think
great.
it's online somewhere. Yeah, I can try to find it.
Okay, maybe later on. Thanks.
Yeah.
Maybe some of the class wants to ask a question. It would be really nice to open this discussion, because we had, Oliver, a very good discussion on the films that we have watched in the class, especially regarding the issue of autonomy and really the true possibilities of organizing decisions, political decisions horizontally. This was related to the ZAD. We were very interested also in listening to the comments of some of the activists, some of the inhabitants of the ZAD, talking about the fact that democracy is another failing system, if I remember correctly, because you are always crashing a minority, that's so to say, that in certain cases is also the 44 or 49%, so it's not really a minority. And the fact that they are taking their decisions in taking into account of all these differences. So maybe some of you can make a commentary either on this or on the films that we have watched, or maybe you will only have a question to Oliver.
Hi, may I say something? Hi, so this is not directly connected to your work, but I have reminded of this article when I was seeing your work, or yeah. So I was reminded of the thumping in China, which was like kind of like movement by younger Chinese people who got kind of depressed by the current situation in China, because, or like maybe in Japan as well, because the government, I'm Japanese, because the government doesn't do like how can I say improvement in general for especially for younger people, because government sees like older people are important, so we are kind of depressed, and this kind of movement. And I feel like kind of this in my mind, like when I was seeing the work about environmental problem or like drastic climate change, like yeah, and like in general, it kind of the distance for me, like I see like this movement about climate change is happening around us, but I feel also like depressed or disappointed. Like, so in general, my question is, how do you feel about thumping? It's kind of like not really not kind of directly connected to your work, but I'm asking just by my curiosity.
Sorry, if I may intervene, Yayate, thank you so much for this link that you have just shared with all the class. A super interesting article about these people called, at least in my English translation, the Lie Down Tribe, spreading to young people in China. This is related to China, at least, with no aspirations and no consumption, so just lying down. This is a sort of very extreme case of degrowth attempt, I think, that is in a way, as I see it at least, and then Oliver can tell us what he thinks. This is a very good example of how the climate change situation and this perception of a possible future apocalypse is polarizing positions. So on one side we have the Greta Thunberg generation raising their voices, raising their power and trying really to make pressure on the political system. And on the other hand, we had another polarized position of people, young generations as well, who just have lost all hope and decide just to refrain from all action. And in the article you shared is very clear: do not buy anything, do not love anyone, do not do absolutely anything, right? Super interesting. Thanks a lot, Ayate, for this. Oliver, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, from my point of view, it's not a solution, and there should not be a way of where you avoid resisting. I think there's just too much to lose, right? And I think it's never too late to become active. I mean, even though when what is completely impossible and would be completely unexpected, but even when in a very short period of time of a few years, somehow we manage as humanity to get a decarbonized society and climate justice, the temperatures would still rise. But every year it takes longer that we reach these goals. It's more and more millions more people, primarily in the global south, who lose their possibility to survive in their countries of origin. So therefore, I think it's super time sensitive, and it's also the responsibility of us in the north, primarily in Europe, in the US, Australia or Japan, or Russia, to involve in this struggle and not to give up, just because it's also the historical responsibility of the rich northern industrialized countries, and it's our governments, even though we might not so much be in solidarity with them or might be opposed to them, they are still acting on behalf of them, of us at least, they claim. And so I think there's a moral responsibility of our generation and the greater generation to continue this struggle. I can understand that you get depressed. The climate justice movement had the largest level of mobilization till the beginning of the pandemic it reached ever. And even though this level of mobilization was reached, I mean, there were a few quite important things that happened as a result, but in general, emissions are still on the rise, right? And now we reach the same level as pre-pandemic level. And we see the outcomes from the COP26 in Glasgow, and they are again very depressing, and it's a real catastrophe that there's not even an agreement to end coal with a certain date, and there's not really true commitments to change this destructive system. So I understand that you get depressed, but I think it's no way of an action that we should support.
Then I think what's gonna be the difference? I mean, like of me and you. I'm sorry if this sounds really rude, but like after I came to here, Germany, I feel like lots of people are engaging in climate change movement, or like at least kind of be aware of climate change itself. But like in Japan, I feel like it's kind of like how can I say kind of hesitated to talk about because kind of like already seen as a thumping, like it's kind of like like awareness is kind of like the mutual trend for young people in Japan, I feel.
May I step in to say just one thing to Oliver and clarify your comment, which is very interesting, Ayate. We have been speaking a lot during our class about whether some of these massive activist movements that are happening today, for example, so in support of the Black Lives Matter or in support of climate change, by people who were maybe before not as politically engaged as they are today, may respond to more of a trend. You know, Oliver, what I mean a trend, rather than really a long-term, long-lasting political implication towards social change, and how some of this may also hijack certain movement and making them lose power instead of gaining their voice. And one of the examples that was done was regarding the Black Lives Matter movement, for example. It's just one example, but during the Black Lives Matter movement, many white people were supporting this. Somehow, some had the feeling that more white people were entitled to talk about this rather Black people, and that this was in a way an operation of removing their voice even further and making them disappear even further through through hijacking what they wanted to say with the demonstrations. So I think that Hayate's commentary is very much related to the discussion we had. And it would be interesting to ask you, where do you stand regarding this?
Yeah, I don't think by any means that it's a trend. I think these young people take it very seriously. But I think that many of them get disappointed and discouraged after maybe a few months or a few years. Some of them are young and politically inexperienced, and they maybe also don't really understand how the system of representative democracy works and is interrelated with capitalism, and that it's not only the best ideas and maybe also the right ideas, but that there is just a certain power structure in the back that is very important and influences certain political decisions. And therefore, yeah, many get depressed, many young people get depressed, burned out, and decide finally to just find their way to continue living and just get a job and maybe a car, maybe even an SUV. I don't know. But I mean, that's no new phenomenon. And at the moment, there's a quite big discussion within the climate justice movement. I'm talking more about the more leftist and more radical components of the movement, about what might be upcoming steps, right? I mean, we saw millions of people marching. We saw major infrastructure like coal mines, harbors, airports within the European Union blocked for hours, days, and some for even longer. But still, this did not really make major changes in the political system, right? So I think what we will see, and I'm not saying that this is good or bad, but what we will see is much more radicalized reactions by people who come from the climate justice movement that will simply, I think, blow up certain infrastructure. Some of these people take it very seriously, and they know it's a decision between life and death. And some of them are so committed that they will risk their life in order to blow up things. They not maybe on a personal level, but they, as part of the movement, tried out things of civil disobedience, non-violent actions for such a long time, and they did not lead to these results that are just needed. And it's so easy to understand what it's needed, right? We see highway constructions everywhere around the globe. There are hundreds of new coal-fired power plants being built right now. At the moment in this year, there are, I think, altogether it's 800 new airport constructions all over the globe being built at the moment. So we don't see this understanding of those in power that at least we have to skip new infrastructure. It's already bad enough to continue with the fossil-fired infrastructure in place, but at least there should be the consensus not to build new infrastructure and to use the existing infrastructure to fuel the decarbonization. Because in order to build up this new decarbonized infrastructure, we need to use the petroleum actually, right? We cannot build this out of the blue. But yeah, it's a really difficult situation.
Thank you so much,
thank you,
Oliver. Does anyone else wants to have a last question?
Maybe I would be interested if you, like, when documenting those movements, if you ever come across situations where you feel like there's coming some input that you find problematic, and how you deal with it. Because also, like, for example, with this topic of like non-violent action, I feel like there is like parts of the climate justice movements in Europe that is like very that is coming from like a very middle class, white and privileged perspective that is always like very focused and stressing that they're non-violent, and even like making friends with the police and like thanking the police for like being so cooperative, and somehow therefore also being aligned with capitalism very much, I think. And how, I don't know, how you somehow deal with, also I of course don't know how you position yourself on this spectrum maybe, but yeah, just how you deal with maybe contradictions sometimes.
This is a very important question. Thanks for that. I mean, the climate justice movement is so broad, right? And there are so many different groups and individuals and organizations involved in it. And I mean, I decided as an artist that I will just choose those protagonists and those aspects and those sectors of the movement I think are worth being supported, and where I'm ready to commit. Like most of these films cost me like 1 year of my life, right? So if you invest 1 year of your life into something, you have to be convinced that it's worth this 1 year of the life. And yeah, I mean, this is also a reason why I do not use myself the label documentary for my work. Even though my work uses documentary aspects, it's not documenting in that sense which you find very often, that you try to have something like a neutral perspective of a camera. No, I very clearly pick out certain aspects I think that are worth being picked out. So to some extent, working on these films and working on this archive of resistance in relation to the climate justice movement is also an attempt to form the movement in a way as I wish it would be and hope it would be to some extent, right? I mean, numerous times, not only in the climate justice movement, but also in certain other movements I was working with and kind of part of, I experienced things I disliked, right? Yeah, I try to reflect on that, and very often it's a quite conscious decision then to leave away those parts I find problematic, because what I try to do with these films to kind of amplify certain forms of resistance or certain interesting discussions, or to amplify certain models of decision-making processes I find are important. And yeah, of course, I therefore feel that I have the right to include, I don't know, a sexist comment or whatever.
Thank you. Yes, I understand also that it makes sense to be selective on what to show and what not.
Thank you very much, Oliver. I think that we have taken enough of your time, but it's been a very interesting presentation. And again, thank you very much for sharing your time with us.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me here, and good luck with the upcoming work.
Thanks a lot. And in the very good tradition of your work, we will share this talk online as well.
Cool.
Yeah, thanks for coming and talking with us and your presentation. Thanks a lot.
Okay.
Hope to see you soon. I'm not in Vienna, but maybe there might be another exhibition where we meet.
Yeah, hopefully, yes.
Time in Vienna.
Okay. Ciao to everyone.
Bye,
Ciao.
Oliver. Thanks.